The air in the command bunker was a solid thing. It was the taste of chilled earth, of cheap tobacco, smoked down to the filter, of sweat that had gone cold and sour with fear. It was the silence after a scream. Major Ivan Grekov stood before the situation map, and the red lines upon it were not markings. They were hemorrhages. Each crimson arrow, plunging toward Moscow, was a cut that drained the life from the motherland. The reports were a continuous, low-grade tremor through the floor. The thunder at the gates was no longer a metaphor. It was geology. His own war was fought here, in this subterranean room lit by harsh bulbs. His weapons were manifests, timetables, and freight car capacities. His uniform was clean, his hands stained with ink, not dirt or oil. He had been proud of this. Now it felt like a grotesque joke. For 3 days, he had been trying to solve an equation with no solution. The answer was always 0. The 37th Tank Brigade, 32 fresh T-34s, and their crews waited 500 meters away in a frozen rail yard. They were a clenched steel fist, and they were paralyzed. The reconnaissance photos, delivered hourly by a courier with the eyes of a ghost, told the grim story of the main supply lines. They were not railways anymore. They were open-air mortuaries. A burned-out locomotive here, its tender flipped like a child's toy. A line of flat cars carrying the skeletal remains of what were once artillery pieces. Bridges hanging in the water like the broken spines of giant beasts. The Luftwaffe ruled that sky with the calm precision of master butchers. They hunted in packs, and anything that moved, that smelled of fuel and purpose, was found, circled, and dissected from the air. To send the brigade down those tracks was not a military operation. It was a ceremonial sacrifice. Grekov's own failure was a sharp, physical stone in his gut. Just 72 hours earlier, a supply train he had personally routed, carrying not tanks, but precious ammunition and medical supplies, had been pinpointed and obliterated near Rzhev. The telegraph message had been brutally concise. Eisenbahnzug, 741 total Verlust. Keine Überlebenden. No survivors. Among them had been the train's chief engineer, a man named Pyotr, who had shared Grekov's pre-war world of schedules and steam pressures. A quiet man who painted miniature landscapes in his bunk. He was now a line in a German logistics report. Grekov had signed the order that sent him into that sky of fire. The guilt was a quiet, constant companion, colder than the Urals' winter outside. A colonel, his face a landscape of exhaustion and fury, entered the bunker. He didn't look at the map. He looked through it. The directive from Stavka is final. The colonel's voice was ground glass. The brigade must detrain at the front reserve line by 0600, 3 days from now. If they are not there, the line will not hold. And you and I, Major, will be held accountable for treason, for the abandonment of position. Do you understand the gravity? This is not a delay. This is a verdict. The finality of it pressed down on Grekov. 3 days. It was an impossible distance. The equation remained. Movement equals destruction. He was being ordered to achieve the physically impossible. His eyes, burning from lack of sleep, drifted to the latest batch of photos. They were a catalogue of ruin. Then one image, clipped to a follow-up aerial shot from the next day, snagged his attention. It showed the same stretch of track, a goods train, utterly destroyed in the first photo. In the second, taken 24 hours later, it lay in exactly the same state of devastation. Untouched, unmolested. The German pilots had seen it. They had recorded its death. They had moved on. A dead thing was of no interest. It was background noise. It was part of the scenery of victory. A thought, vile and grotesque, bubbled up from the depths of his exhaustion. It was so insane his mind immediately tried to reject it, to take the most potent symbols of defiance, the sleek, hard-edged T-34s, and dress them as corpses, to not hide life from the hunter, but to show him death so convincing he would look away, to build a monument to ruin and hide an army inside it. It was a desecration of the very machines meant to save them. It was a psychological obscenity. He pushed the idea away. It was the madness of a breaking mind. He focused on the photos again, on the dead train. The Germans were meticulous. They were thorough. They trusted their own eyes, their own records. A thing killed stayed killed. The colonel was staring at him, waiting for a miracle that did not exist in any manual. The stone of guilt for Pyotr's death shifted inside Grekov, hot and acidic. He had sent a man to his death with a signature. Could he now perhaps save 3,000 men with an illusion? The insane thought returned, not as a spark, but as a cold, settling conviction. It wasn't inspiration. It was a last, desperate handhold on the edge of an abyss. He felt no brilliance, only a profound and weary recklessness. He picked up the two photos, the before and after of the annihilated train. His voice, when it came, was flat, stripped of all emotion, the voice of a man stating a grim fact of engineering. There is a way, Colonel, but it requires us to stop thinking like quartermasters and start thinking like grave robbers. We cannot run a live train past them. They will hear its heartbeat. So we will send them a ghost, a train that is already dead. We will give them exactly what their reports say should be there. We will hide our steel in a coffin of their own making. Permission was not granted. It was extracted, like a rotten tooth, with pain and reluctance. The colonel had stared at Grekov as if he had proposed mutiny. But the grim clock was ticking, and the alternative was a firing squad for them all. Grekov was given not a blessing, but a curse of responsibility. One train, a test. If it worked, they would scale the madness. If it failed, the loss would be written off as just another tragic entry in the ledger of catastrophe, and Grekov would follow it into oblivion. His first act was not to visit the depot, but to descend into the belly of the rail yards, to a place that smelled of damp concrete and chemical decay. This was the domain of the broken, the cannibalized, the waiting dead. Locomotives with shattered boilers sat on sidings like beached iron whales. Freight cars, their sides peeled open by shrapnel, groaned in the wind. Here, Grekov found his first essential madman. He was called Yevgeny, though no one used his rank anymore. A former stage designer from the Moscow Art Theater, conscripted not for his aim, but for his eye. His war had been spent painting fake airfields and wooden tanks to divert German bombers. It was a war of illusion, and he had grown cynical in its service. He was a small man with perpetually stained fingers, hunched over a shattered boxcar, sketching the precise pattern of scorch marks on its timber, with the focus of a portrait artist. Grekov found him and simply laid the two reconnaissance photos side by side on a splintered crate. He pointed to the dead train, then to the graveyard of real ruins around them. He said nothing about tanks. He spoke only of truth. We need to build a lie so perfect it becomes a fact. We need to create that, Grekov said, his voice low, gesturing to the photo. Not a replica. a truth, a thing that is, in every visible way, already dead. Yevgeny studied the photos, then looked at Grekov, not with skepticism, but with a dark, professional interest. He saw not an officer, but a fellow creator of necessary fictions. He touched the photo of the bombed train. The Germans are not artists. They are accountants. They see categories. Destroyed, heavy damage, abandoned. They check the box and fly on. The trick is not to mimic damage. It is to confirm their category. He finally looked up. What is the canvas? The canvas is a working flatbed train. The subject is 32 tons of steel each that must become part of the scenery. For the first time in months, a light other than bitterness flickered in Yevgeny's eyes. It was the terrifying spark of a truly grotesque challenge. He nodded once, a contract sealed in silence. The second recruit was found in a heated maintenance shed, a pocket of defiant warmth. Mikhail, the locomotive engineer, was a bear of a man with a face etched by decades of wind and coal dust. He was a legend on the Urals line, a man who could hear a worn axle 3 kilometers away. His last train had been shot out from under him near Smolensk. He had crawled back with shrapnel in his leg and a fury that burned colder than any furnace. He was healing, and he was bored, which made him dangerous. Grekov approached him, not with orders, but with a map and a question. He showed him the intended route, a spider web of secondary and tertiary lines, bypassing main junctions, skirting open plains. It was a journey of 1,000 small decisions, of hidden sidings, of unpredictable stops. "Can you drive a ghost?" Grekov asked. "Can you make a train that is alive move with the rhythm of something that is dead? No schedules, only survival. Long stops in the open, erratic speeds. You will be a sitting duck for hours in plain sight." Mikhail studied the map, his thick finger tracing the labyrinthine path. He understood immediately. This was not about horsepower or braking distances. This was about psychology. It was about becoming part of the landscape, a rock that moves when no one is looking. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. Then he pointed to a long, exposed stretch near a bombed-out village. "Here. We stop here, at dawn. For 3, maybe 4 hours, right in the open. If your artist is as good as you say, we drink tea. If he is not, we die." It was not a statement of fear, but of engineering parameters. He was in. Finally, Grekov went to the tanks themselves. The brigade was billeted in a warehouse, a cavernous space reeking of cold metal, diesel, and the tense anticipation of caged predators. The crews were young, their faces still soft in places, but their eyes were old. They had mastered their machines, only to be told they were prisoners of geography. Their commander, a Captain Sokolov, had the weary patience of a man trying to hold back a dam. Grekov did not offer them a plan. He presented them with a tomb. He explained the concept. The tanks, lashed to open flat cars, would be encased in a false shell of devastation. A framework of wood and canvas would be built around each, making them appear as collapsed, burned-out freight cars or piles of tangled steel beams. The crews would not travel in their tanks. They would be sealed inside dark, cramped, unheated compartments built beneath the false wreckage on the flat cars. They would have no view, no air, no escape during transit. They would be buried alive inside their own disguise, entrusting their fate entirely to the skill of a painter and the nerve of an engineer. The silence that followed was absolute and hostile. Then a young sergeant, his hands black with grease, spoke, his voice trembling with outrage. "You want us to crawl into a coffin? To hide like rats while they fly over us? This is not what we trained for. This is cowardice." Grekov absorbed the word. He took a step closer, his own exhaustion making him seem hollow, almost spectral. "Out there," he said, his voice cutting the cold air. "Cowardice is getting your entire brigade vaporized for a propaganda photo in a German pilot's album. Cowardice is letting your tank become scrap metal before it fires a single shot. Bravery is living. Bravery is arriving." Your bravery is not for this journey. It is for the journey's end. I am not asking you to be soldiers right now. I am asking you to be cargo. Silent, invisible cargo. The hardest fight of your life will be to lie still in the dark and do absolutely nothing while the enemy looks you in the eye and sees nothing. Captain Sokolov studied Grekov's face, seeing the stone of guilt and the shadow of the failed ammo train. He saw a man offering not glory, but a slender, degrading thread of survival. He turned to his men. He is not wrong. A dead T-34 helps no one. A live one, even one that arrives smelling of fear and sawdust, can change a small piece of this war. We will be the cargo. The team was formed. The architect of illusions, the conductor of the ghost, and the sealed, living heart of steel. In a secluded spur of the rail yard, under a canopy of bitter gray sky, they began to build their first lie. Yevgeny directed a team of carpenters and welders with the fervor of a sculptor, not building up, but building down. He studied real wreckage, then reproduced its chaotic geometry over the clean, angular lines of the T-34s. Canvas was stretched, smeared with glue and coated with a slurry of real ash, soot, and rust ground from scrap metal. The pristine green paint was spattered with deliberate, violent patterns of black and burnt umber. Grekov watched as the first tank vanished. It did not look camouflaged. It looked destroyed. It was a heartbreaking sight. It was also, he felt with a cold clutch in his stomach, the only possible truth that could survive. The ghost train was no longer an idea. It was a monstrous, skeletal thing taking shape on the rails, waiting for its soul of fire and its baptism of ice. The creation stood complete on a forgotten spur of track, a blasphemy against the very idea of military power. It was no longer a train. It was a scar. A procession of 8 flat cars, each bearing a grotesque, silent tumulus of devastation. What had been the sleek, predatory silhouette of a T-34 was now an anonymous heap under a shroud of fabricated ruin. Canvas, shaped and stiffened with glue into the frozen waves of torn metal, was coated in a thick, granular paste of real ash, powdered coal, and rust. Welded scraps of actual wreckage, twisted I-beams, shattered wheel assemblies, were artfully grafted onto the structures. From a distance of 50 meters, it was a convincing catalogue of despair. A burned-out boxcar slumped on its frame, a pile of collapsed structural steel, the exposed, blackened ribs of a freight car's carcass. Up close, the illusion was fragile. The smell was wrong, not the ozone and oil of destruction, but the sour odor of glue and damp canvas. But Grekov was betting everything on the distant speeding view from a cockpit hundreds of meters in the air. Yevgeny, his hands black to the elbow, moved with a quiet mania, adding final touches. A streak of gleaming silver where fresh metal was supposedly exposed. A careful spray of watered-down mud to simulate rust streaks from recent rain. He was not painting a picture. He was writing a forensic report in texture, and shadow. Beneath each false ruin, a tomb had been constructed. Between the flat car's deck and the false hull, a narrow, coffin-like compartment of reinforced timber. Inside, on bare planks, 4 tank crewmen would lie for the duration. There were no windows, only small, concealed air vents, a single, dim, battery-powered bulb. The space was so tight a man could not sit up. They would travel in total darkness, in crushing silence, smelling the pine resin of their own tomb and the cold sweat of the man next to them. Their only link to the outside world was a thin copper speaking tube running to the locomotive cab. Captain Sokolov oversaw the loading of his men. There were no speeches. Each crew, carrying their personal weapons and a cruel minimum of rations, approached their designated mound. They paused, a collective instinct of revulsion freezing them for a moment. They were not boarding their weapon. They were interring themselves. One by one, they dropped to their knees and crawled into the narrow hatch, cut into the false wreckage, disappearing from the light. The last man in each team pulled the hatch closed from inside, plunging them into absolute black. The sound of wooden bolts being slid home from the inside was the most final sound Grekov had ever heard. Mikhail, the engineer, performed his own rituals. He walked the length of the train not as a conductor, but as a hunter assessing a trap. He checked the special couplings, designed to give a slack, irregular motion, unlike the tight, purposeful pull of a military train. He studied the locomotive, an old series OV, chosen for its common, unremarkable profile. Under his direction, its sides had been streaked with grime, and its number plates swapped with those from a repair yard. It now looked like a weary workhorse relegated to hauling away debris, not leading a spearhead. The final member arrived without ceremony. A young female signals officer, Lieutenant Vera Rostova, assigned as their link to the fragmented, often silent network of partisan observers and remaining rail stations. She was slight, with a face that seemed too delicate for the heavy headset she carried, but her eyes held the same flat, hardened focus as Mikhail's. She knew the codes for the air raid warning network along the secondary lines. She was their single ear to the sky. As the weak afternoon sun began to fail, Grekov stood before the assembled nucleus of the operation. Yevgeny, vibrating with nervous energy. Mikhail, a statue of impassive readiness. Vera, calibrating her radio with methodical precision, and Captain Sokolov's voice, emerging tinny and hollow from the speaking tube, confirming his men were sealed in their tombs. There was nothing more to prepare. No fanfare. No orders from high command wishing them luck. This was a rogue experiment, a secret born of desperation. Grekov gave a single sharp nod to Mikhail. With a series of metallic shudders and a vast exhalation of steam that turned to ice fog in the twilight, the locomotive came to life. The sound was wrong. Mikhail had adjusted the valves to produce a wheezing, labored chuff, the sound of a machine on its last legs. The train did not pull forward with purpose. It lurched, the slack in the couplings rattling down its length with a tired, disjointed clatter that spoke of neglect and decay. They moved out of the spur at a funeral pace, merging onto a secondary line that skirted the main arteries. The world outside Grekov's cab window was a monochrome blur of frozen forests and abandoned sidings. Inside, the tension was a physical presence, thicker than the coal dust in the air. Vera's headphones hissed with static, every crackle making her spine straighten a fraction. Mikhail's eyes were locked ahead, reading the rails, the sky, the wind. Grekov watched the first hours pass in a nerve-shredding monotony. They were a creeping wound on the landscape. They stopped for no reason at the edge of a shattered village, sitting in plain view for 20 agonizing minutes, mimicking a train abandoned by its crew. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling metal and the frantic hammer of Grekov's own heart. He imagined the men in the tombs, lying in the utter dark, feeling the vibration cease, wondering if this was the moment a shadow passed over the sun. Dawn broke, a dirty smear of light in the east. It was the most dangerous time. The light was flat, perfect for aerial observation. They were crossing a wide, snow-covered plain, utterly exposed. Mikhail had chosen this, the ultimate test. Then Vera stiffened. Her hand shot up, clenched in a fist. The headphones screamed a shrill, coded warning from a partisan cell 50 kilometers ahead. Luftwaffe Reconnaissance Patrol. Fieseler Storch. Grid Sector 7. Heading west. A slow, high-winged observation plane. The eyes of the artillery, the most curious, the most meticulous of hunters. Mikhail did not increase speed. He slowed further. The train's labored chuff became even more pathetic, a dying breath. He was following the script of a cripple. Grekov, through a periscope Yevgeny had rigged from a drain pipe, saw it. A small, predatory shape against the gray wool of the sky, growing steadily larger. It was moving directly toward their line of travel. He felt a cold void open in his chest. This was it. The first and final judgment. Every flaw in Yevgeny's art, every betraying glint of metal, every too-perfect shadow would be laid bare under the magnifying glass of that slow-flying plane. He thought of the men in the dark, hearing the approaching drone through the timber and steel. He thought of Pyotr in his burning train. The Fieseler Stork adjusted its course, drawn to the motionless, dark scar on the white plain. It circled once, high, a hawk sizing up carrion. Then it descended, its engine note deepening, and made a second, lower pass. Grekov could see the outline of the observer in the glass cockpit, the man's head tilted, studying the wreckage below. The plane was so close he could see the individual crosses on the wings. The world stopped. The only sound was the distant, insolent buzz of the German engine. The plane banked, its wings tipping, as the observer took his final, long look at the pathetic, bombed-out train below. A piece of wreckage not even worth noting on a map. Then, with a lazy increase in throttle, the Fieseler Storch straightened its course and continued westward, shrinking into the morning haze until it was gone. The silence it left behind was deafening. No one in the cab moved. No one breathed. They were still playing dead. A full minute passed. Then another. From the speaking tube, a whisper, raw and strained, crawled out. It was Captain Sokolov's voice. "Is it over?" Grekov looked at Mikhail. The engineer's knuckles were white on the brake handle, but he gave a single, infinitesimal nod. He had not blinked during the entire overflight. Grekov leaned to the tube, his own voice a dry rustle. "It is over." He looked. He saw nothing. In the tombs below, in the absolute dark, 32 men let out a collective, shuddering breath they had not realized they were holding. They had been seen, and they had been ignored. The ghost had passed its first, terrifying audition. The plan was not just madness. It was a monstrous, brilliant kind of magic. And it worked. The success was a poison, sweet and paralyzing. For a few hours after the Fiesler Storch vanished, a fragile electric euphoria crackled through the ghost train. In the locomotive cab, the shared, unspoken terror had forged a bond between Grekov, Mikhail, and Vera, tighter than any steel coupling. Yevgeny, when informed via a hissed message down the line, had simply closed his eyes and leaned against the soot-stained wall of his makeshift carriage, a tremor running through his ash-caked hands. Beneath the false ruins, in the absolute blackness, men allowed themselves to believe. They whispered congratulations in the dark, the taste of victory like cold iron on their tongues. They had stared into the face of the enemy and been rendered invisible. This feeling lasted until the next stop, in the skeletal remains of a water tower, its tank riddled with holes like a colossal sieve. As Mikhail tended to the locomotive's thirsty boiler with a careful, measured slowness, Grekov unfolded the larger map. The single, thin pencil line marking their test route was a child's scribble compared to the monstrous task now looming. The colonel's verdict echoed in his skull. The entire brigade. 3 days. One ghost train was a conjurer's trick. Moving an entire tank brigade was an act of logistical sorcery on a scale that defied reason. The euphoria curdled, replaced by a crushing weight of calculus. The problem unfolded before him not as a plan, but as a terrifying equation of space, time, and perception. First, the sheer volume. 32 tanks were not 8, they would require not 1, but 4 separate ghost trains, each a unique sculpture of ruin. They could not travel together. A cluster of wrecks was as suspicious as a pristine column. They would need to be spaced out, launched at staggered intervals, traveling on different, often parallel, secondary lines. They would become a dispersed infection of deception, moving slowly westward. Second, the routes. The main lines were rivers of death. He had to chart a web of forgotten tracks, industrial spurs, and pre-revolutionary branch lines that twisted through forests, hugged ravines, and skirted the backs of towns like a thief. These were poorly maintained, sometimes unmapped, their junctions manned by ancient, bewildered signalmen or partisans who communicated in riddles. Mikhail's knowledge became their most precious commodity. The old engineer pored over the map with Grekov. His thick, calloused finger tracing paths Grekov's staff maps didn't show. This line, it served a gypsum mine, closed in '38. Rails will be rusty, but they'll hold. It passes through a 2-kilometer cutting, invisible from the air. Each such choice was a gamble on infrastructure that might have been sabotaged or simply reclaimed by the earth. Third, and most perilous, was the pattern. The enemy's aerial reconnaissance was not random. It was a system. They photographed, they compared, they noted changes. A single, destroyed train appearing was plausible. A second, 50 kilometers away, might be noted. A third, a fourth. It would form a pattern. A pattern would spark curiosity. Curiosity would bring not a lone Fiesler Storch, but a flight of Ju-88 bombers sent to sanitize a puzzling anomaly. Grekov's mind, trained for order, now had to architect chaos. He called it the geometry of madness. Each train had to be a unique masterpiece of destruction. One would mimic a bombed fuel train, Yevgeny's mind already racing with ideas for fake, ruptured oil drums and stains. Another would appear as a convoy of shattered flat cars carrying industrial machinery. A third as a mixed train of passenger cars and freight, hit from the side. The fourth, Perhaps a supply train for a bridge repair crew, abandoned after an attack. Each story had to be visually distinct, yet equally final. They had to populate the German aerial atlas with varied, convincing entries under the category abandoned wreckage. No threat. But the men. This was the cruelest variable. 4 times the number of souls buried alive in those lightless, freezing compartments. The psychological toll of the test run had been immense, and it had lasted less than a day. The full journey would take 3 nights and 2 days of terrifying daylight stops. Men would break. Claustrophobia, panic, the agony of immobility in the biting cold. These were enemies as real as the Luftwaffe. They needed a system, a rotation however brief, to let men out to breathe the poisoned air during the longest stops in deep forest cover. They needed silence protocols, sanitation protocols, a way to manage the creeping insanity. Grekov drafted the orders in a small, precise script by the light of a shuttered lantern in the cab. Each train would have its own conductor, an officer like him, a believer in the terrible math. Each would have its own Yevgeny, an artist of despair recruited from the decoy battalions. Each would have its own Mikhail, a grizzled rail veteran who knew the veins of the land. And each would have its own Vera, a nervous system connected to the partisan air raid WhisperNet. They would communicate not by vulnerable radio, but through a chain of trusted agents at prearranged dead drop points. A hollow tree, a specific milepost, a ruined church altar. Messages would be left, retrieved hours later. The left hand would never know what the right was doing, preserving the operational security of the whole. The entire operation was a house of cards built on a foundation of individual nerve and perfect, isolated execution. As the ghost train limped into a dense pine forest for its long daytime hide, Grekov assembled his core team. He laid out the map, now a spiderweb of potential routes marked in 4 different colored pencils. He explained the geometry of madness, the need for unique stories, the staggered launches, the absolute isolation. Mikhail nodded slowly, his eyes tracing the routes, already living the journeys in his mind. The timing, the intervals, they cannot be regular. We must be unpredictable, like real debris caught in a current. Yevgeny's eyes glinted with a dark fire. 4 different wrecks, 4 different tragedies. This is not camouflage. This is a theater of the dead. I will need more men. Real soot. Real burned wood. Vera's face was pale but set. The partisan net is fragile. Messages will be delayed, misunderstood. We will be blind for hours at a time. Grekov accepted all of it. There were no perfect solutions, only calculated degradations of risk. The plan was a monstrous, fragile organism. Its strength lay in its very absurdity, in the enemy's inability to conceive of an opponent who would go to such depraved, ingenious lengths to appear defeated. That night, as the test train sat silently in the whispering pines, Grekov crawled out along the flat cars. He pressed his ear to the cold, ash-painted canvas of a false ruin. From within, he heard not the silence of the grave, but the low, strained sound of a man weeping, quickly stifled. It was the sound of the human cost of his geometry. It was the sound of the pressure building in the sealed tombs, a pressure that had to hold for 3 more days across 4 trains. He did not knock. He did not offer comfort. He simply stood there in the freezing dark, a sentinel to their suffering, bearing witness to the first fissure in the human element of his equation. The success of the test run was now irrelevant. They were no longer proving a concept. They were constructing a cathedral of lies, and its foundations were the cracking sanity of buried men. The real operation began not with a departure, but with this terrible silent acknowledgement of the price. The view from 5,000 meters was one of godlike clarity. Oberleutnant Erich Krause banked his Messerschmitt Bf 110 lightly, the twin engines a steady drone in his ears, the morning sun glaring off the endless, snow-dusted tapestry of Russia below. His mission log was crisp, his fuel gauge ample, the sky empty of the ragged furballs of Soviet fighters. It was, on the surface, a routine reconnaissance sweep along the secondary rail lines west of the Urals industrial zone. A sanitization check. Krause was not a typical ace. His cockpit was not adorned with rows of kill marks for aircraft. His tally, marked by small, meticulous bomb symbols, was for locomotives, marshalling yards, and armored trains. He was a specialist, a master of what the Luftwaffe called Eisenbahnkrieg, railway war. His eye was trained not for the darting shape of a fighter, but for the telltale smear of coal smoke against the gray landscape, the straight betraying geometry of a train cutting through the amorphous terrain. He took a professional, cold pride in his work. Severing the enemy's arteries was a cleaner, more strategic kill than any dogfight. His observer, Feldwebel Hahn, methodically scanned the ground through his glazed panel, calling out coordinates and landmarks in a bored monotone. Below them passed a familiar landscape of ruin. A burned-out village here, a shattered bridge there, the parallel scars of rail lines, some intact, many severed. Wrecks were commonplace. They were waypoints of German efficiency. A grid sector 8 Alpha, Hahn intoned. Rail junction. Minor damage on eastern spur. Debris train, visible on siding, appears static. Krause let the plane drift lower, circling. There it was. A string of charred, crumpled freight cars on a spur line. A textbook result of a Junkers 88's work. He noted its position almost automatically. Another entry for the logistics boys to catalog. Line clear. Wreckage present. The day wore on, sector after sector. The routine was hypnotic. Then, in Sector 9 Charlie, something faintly nudged the edge of Krause's consciousness. Another wrecked train, this one on a different line, a branch leading toward a defunct mining district. It was a different type of wreck, more of a collapsed, scattered mess, as if carrying structural steel. He noted it. A coincidence of war. The Soviets had lost a lot of material. It was in the afternoon, on the long return leg, that the nudge became a prickling sense of dissonance. In Sector 7 Bravo, a line that should have been utterly deserted, there was a third wreck. This one looked like a derailed and burned-out fuel or water carrier, the cars bloated and blackened. 3 separate destroyed trains on 3 separate minor, non-strategic lines in one operational zone. Krause banked more steeply, descending to 2,000 meters. Hahn, photograph all 3 wreck sites, maximum detail. Sir, they're just wrecks. Photograph them. The camera in the nose of the Messerschmitt whirred. Krause circled the 3rd site longer than necessary. Nothing moved. No signs of life. No fresh tracks in the snow around it. It was perfectly dead. And yet, the pattern. It was not the pattern of bombs, which clustered around key points. This was a scattering. A random seeding of destruction where there was no valuable target. His mind, a precise instrument for pattern recognition, detected a faint, statistical anomaly. A ghost in the data. Back at the forward airfield, a grim place of frozen mud and roaring heaters, Krauss went straight to the intelligence shack. He demanded the aerial photos from the previous 3 days for those sectors. He spread them on a lit table, his flying gloves leaving smudges on the gloss. He found the first wreck. It was there yesterday, yes, in the same state. The second wreck appeared on photos from the day before that. The third, he traced it back. It was not in photos from 48 hours ago. It had appeared on a line that had been clear. A cold, professional curiosity ignited within him, cutting through the fatigue. He summoned the logistics officer, a harried captain, whose war was fought with timetables and freight manifests. "These wrecks," Krauss pointed, "are they scheduled for clearance? Are the partisans salvaging them?" The captain scoffed, shaking his head. "On those backwater lines? Unlikely. We hit them. We list them. Clearing them is a task for after the victory. Why waste resources? They are just scenery now. Scenery." The word hung in the smoky air. Scenery was passive. Scenery did not appear. That night in the officers' mess, Krauss's silence was conspicuous. Around him, pilots boasted of kills, complained about the cold, longed for leave. He stared into his ersatz coffee, seeing the map. 3 points, forming no logical line, serving no tactical purpose. But what if they were not points, but a moving point, captured at different times? What if the wreck was not where it had died, but where it was pretending to be dead? The thought was heretical. It was absurd. It implied a level of ingenuity, of patient, macabre theater, from an enemy he had been trained to see as a blunt, sacrificing horde. It would be an act of such profound psychological perversion to hide strength in a mask of utter weakness. He thought of his own efficiency, his own methodology. He saw a wreck. He checked his log. He moved on. The system was built on the assumption that the enemy's destruction was permanent and static. What if the enemy was using the system's own efficiency against it, feeding it a diet of acceptable, ignorable corpses? He couldn't prove it. Not a shred of evidence beyond a feeling in his gut, a pattern that whispered rather than shouted. To raise an alarm based on this would invite ridicule. He needed a crack, a flaw in the performance. The next morning, he altered his flight plan without reporting the full reason. He went back to the sector where the third wreck, the fuel train, had appeared. He flew low, dangerously low, skimming the treetops, his shadow racing across the snow. He approached from a different angle, the sun behind him. And there it was, sitting on a lonely stretch between 2 frozen birch forests. From high up, it was perfect. But from this low, oblique angle, with the sharp morning light raking across its surface, something caught the light. A hard, straight, geometric reflection. A brief, bright speck of shine on what should have been irregular, soot-choked wreckage. It was there for a fraction of a second, as he roared past at 400 kilometers per hour. Then it was gone. It could have been a piece of broken window glass, a sliver of ice. But it was a clean reflection, the kind made by metal. Krauss pulled up, his heart hammering not with fear, but with the fierce thrill of the hunt. He had seen the ghost blink. He didn't have proof. But he now had a target, a hypothesis to test. He would not report this. Not yet. They would dismiss him. He needed more. He would watch. He would study the patterns others ignored. He would wait for the ghost to make a mistake, or for another one to appear. And when it did, he would be ready. He was no longer just conducting rail interdiction. He had a personal mission now. He was hunting the thing that was not there, the ghost in the German machine. The geometry of madness was in motion. Across the vast, frozen expanse between the Urals and the front, 4 separate ghost trains crept westward like spores on the wind. Each was a unique tragedy frozen in steel and ash. Train 2, disguised as a derailed convoy of industrial machinery, spent 12 motionless hours in an open field as a squadron of Heinkel 111s droned overhead, bound for a more important target. Train 3, the shattered bridge repair supply train, was nearly discovered by a German motorized patrol that stopped to search for salvage. The Soviet tank crews, buried in their tombs, listened to the guttural sounds of German speech and the boots on the gravel just meters away, their hands clamped over their own mouths to silence their breathing. Train 4 suffered a near-catastrophic mechanical failure, a seized axle, and had to be repaired in the open, under the pretense of being a recovery team slowly picking at a carcass, a performance of lethargic futility that lasted an agonizing 8 hours. Grekov, on the lead train, now dubbed Ghost 1, existed in a state of perpetual vibrating tension. The successful test run was a memory. Every minute was a new gauntlet. Vera's partisan network provided fragmentary, often delayed warnings, a blur of coded panic about patrols, aircraft, and shifting front lines that she translated into cold probabilities. Mikhail drove not by schedule but by instinct, reading the sky and the landscape like a hunted animal, his decisions instantaneous and irrevocable. A wrong turn onto a line that was more heavily surveilled, a stop in a location that was too perfect, a change in the light that made their disguise look flat. Any of it could mean death. The strain was etching itself into all of them. Yevgeny, once buzzing with manic creativity, now moved with a silent, obsessive exhaustion, constantly touching up the disguise, his eyes seeing only potential flaws. In the tombs, the men were breaking down. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grinding, soul-crushing ordeal. The cold was a constant gnawing pain. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight. Men hallucinated from lack of oxygen and sensory deprivation. They argued in whispers that spiraled into near-violent hysteria. Captain Sokolov fought a silent war of morale in the dark, using the speaking tube to deliver quiet, steady reminders of home, of the goal, of the world beyond the wooden walls. But even his voice was growing thin. Grekov felt the operation slipping into a deadly rhythm, a false sense of security. They were exploiting the enemy's blindness, but blindness could be cured. He began to notice subtle signs that the system was adjusting. Reconnaissance flights seemed to linger a fraction longer over certain areas. The patterns of patrols, relayed by Vera, showed a slight, worrying shift toward some of their alternate routes. It was as if the German command was sensing a disturbance in the flow of the war, a vague itch it couldn't quite locate. The cause of this itch was Oberleutnant Erich Krause. He had become a student of ruin. He had quietly requisitioned all reconnaissance photos for a 200-kilometer corridor. He spent his nights not in the mess, but in the intelligence bunker. Photos spread around him, comparing, measuring, tracking. He wasn't looking for trains. He was looking for changes. A new wreck that appeared where one hadn't been. A wreck that seemed to have shifted slightly on a siding between two photo runs. A pattern of dispersal, that, when viewed with cold suspicion, resembled a slow, staggered migration. He had found it. 4 distinct wrecks, each with a unique signature of damage, all moving imperceptibly westward on parallel, low-priority lines. The correlation was too strong to be coincidence. The sheer, grotesque scale of the deception took his breath away. This wasn't a trick. It was a strategic masterpiece of deceit. He took his findings to his Gruppenkommandeur. He laid out the photos, the map with his notations, the timing analysis. He spoke with calm, forensic precision. The commander, a veteran of the Polish and French campaigns, listened, then leaned back, a skeptical frown on his face. "Kraus, you are suggesting the Bolsheviks are expending enormous effort to move nothing? To paint pictures on trains? This is fantasy. These are just wrecks. The wind blows snow, shadows change. You are seeing ghosts?" Kraus did not blink. "I am seeing what they wish us to see. I propose a test. A Zerst Regruppe of U-88s, armed with high explosive and incendiaries on standby. I will fly ahead of them in my Messerschmitt. I will find the most recent, the most perfect of these wrecks. I will make a low, slow pass. I will provoke it. If it is a wreck, we waste a few bombs on scrap. If it is not, we expose the ruse and destroy a significant enemy force in transit." The commander studied Kraus's unshakable certainty. The evidence was circumstantial, but the officer's reputation was impeccable. The risk was low, a few bombs on empty tundra. The potential reward. The idea of an entire Soviet tank brigade being smuggled under their noses was an intolerable humiliation. "Permission granted," the commander said finally. "But you are staking your judgment on this, Kraus. Do not be wrong." Meanwhile, on Ghost 1, Grikov was facing his own crisis. They were approaching the most dangerous leg, a 20-kilometer stretch of elevated track across a wide river valley. It was a notorious shooting gallery for German fighters. The plan was to cross it at dusk, using the fading light as cover. But Vera had just intercepted a frantic, broken, partisan message. The meaning was clear. Increased aerial activity. Junkers, squadrons, repositioning. Unusual interest in valley sector. A trap? Or just bad luck? Grekov stood at the map, the weight of 80 men's lives crushing him. They could wait, hide for another day, but the delay would ripple through the entire geometry of madness, risking the synchronized arrival of the brigade. It could unravel everything. Mikhail looked at him, his face grim. "If we wait, we lose the window. The other trains are counting on our timing. If we go now, we walk into the lion's den." Grekov made the decision. They would go. They had to trust the ghost. They would cross the valley at the appointed time, moving with the slow, pathetic limp of the dead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in blood and purple, Ghost 1 vented a last puff of exhausted steam and began its crawl onto the high trestle bridge over the frozen river. The valley stretched before them, vast and silent. The sound of their own wheels on the rails was like a scream in the stillness. In the sky to the west, a single dark shape detached itself from the failing light. It was a Messerschmitt Bf 110, flying not with predatory speed, but with a slow, deliberate purpose. It was not searching. It was coming straight for them. In the cab, Vera's face went bone white. "One aircraft. Bf 110. It's heading directly for us. Not a patrol pattern. An intercept." Grekov felt the blood drain from his face. This was different. This was not a random reconnaissance. This was a hunter, who had found his quarry. Oberleutnant Kraus circled high above the valley, his eyes fixed on the dark shape crawling across the bridge. The wreck. It matched the profile. The timing was perfect. He keyed his radio, his voice ice cold. Falk to Eisenschel. Gere Group. Target acquired. Grid Delta 7. Hold position. Await my mark. He pushed the stick forward and began his descent. Not for a bombing run, but for an inspection. A final definitive test. He would look this ghost in the eye and see if it blinked. The noose, woven from suspicion and pattern recognition, was now a physical thing in the sky, tightening by the second around the trembling, ash-painted train below. The world reduced itself to a single, terrible point. The growing silhouette of the twin-engine Messerschmitt against the bruised twilight sky. It did not scream down in a dive. It descended with a dreadful, leisurely authority, like a coroner approaching a body. This was not an attack. It was an autopsy. Inside the locomotive cab of Ghost 1, time fractured. The rumble of their own wheels on the trestle bridge became the drum beat of a gallows march. Grekov's orders were whispers, razor-sharp and final. Absolute stillness, no steam, no light. Mikhail, kill the draft. Let her drift. The locomotive's heart seized, the rhythmic chuff dying to a dead man's sigh. The train, by momentum and gravity alone, continued its slow creep across the vast exposed valley. They were playing dead at the moment of maximum scrutiny. Beneath the false ruins, in the absolute blackness, the tank crews sensed the shift. The familiar vibration of the engine ceased, replaced by the ghostly swaying glide of the coasting train and the new, terrifying drone penetrating their wooden tombs. It was a different sound, lower, heavier, closer than the Fieseler Storch's buzz. It was the sound of focused intent. Captain Sokolov, pressed against the icy planks of his compartment, hissed into the speaking tube. Steady. Not a breath. Not a cough. He is right on top of us. Oberleutnant Erich Kraus leveled out at 200 meters. So low, the downdraft from his propellers whipped the snow on the ground into frantic swirls. He throttled back, making the plane wallow, a vulture circling its meal. Through the canopy, the wrecked train was a stark, black scar on the white expanse of the frozen river and the silver tracks. It was perfect. Too perfect? His eyes, trained by hundreds of hours of destruction assessment, scanned for the flaw. The texture of the burned canvas, the way the shattered beams lay, the shadows they cast in the long, low evening light. He banked, making a pass along the entire length of the train. He saw no movement, no heat shimmer from hidden engines, no glint of a watching eye from a seam in the wreckage. It was a masterful piece of stagecraft. But Kraus was no longer an audience member. He was the critic. A memory flashed, the brief, hard reflection days before. He needed to break the picture. He needed to see what was underneath. He pulled up, gained a little altitude, and then came around again. This time he approached from the side, the angle acute. He focused not on the whole, but on a detail, the junction between a false, collapsed boxcar wall and the flatbed beneath it. The light was fading fast, the contrast extreme. As he roared past, his shadow leaping over the train, he saw it. A line. A straight, sharp, unnatural line where the wreckage met the carriage. A seam too clean, too geometric, for the chaos of a high explosive impact. It was the edge of a canvas sheet, a flaw in the artist's grim canvas. A fierce, cold triumph surged through him. He had it. The ghost had a skeleton. He keyed his radio, his voice devoid of emotion. Falk to Eisenschulger. Confirmed. Target is live. Repeat. Target is live. A elaborate deception. You are cleared to engage. Full payload. Obliterate it. In the cab, Vera, monitoring the German frequency with a desperate sinking hope, heard the coded phrase, Ziel ist lebendig. Target is live. Her blood turned to ice. She turned to Grekov, her voice a dry rasp. He knows. He's calling in the bombers. The game was over. The ghost was exposed. Grekov's mind, frozen for a second, snapped into a terrible final clarity. There was no more hiding. There was only one move left. A move from death back into life, however brief and violent. He lunged for the speaking tube, his voice cracking with the force of his shout. Sokolov, he's made us. Bombers inbound. Break out. Man the anti-aircraft guns. Turn this coffin into a fortress. Now. For a second, there was silence from the tombs. Then, a sound like the world breaking apart. Wood splintered, metal shrieked. From hatches concealed within the false wreckage, figures erupted like souls bursting from graves. Tank crewmen, pale, blinking, stiff from cold and immobility, clawed their way into the twilight. They moved with a frantic, jerky urgency, fueled by pure adrenaline. They did not head for their tank hatches. Their tanks were still encased. They scrambled for the pre-positioned, camouflaged heavy machine guns mounted on swivels on the flat cars. The Degtyaryovs, kept oiled and ready under tarps that were part of the debris, were thrown free. Belts of ammunition, gleaming in the last light, were fed into receivers with frantic, practiced hands. On the lead flat car, Captain Sokolov himself grabbed the grips of a DSK heavy machine gun, its water jacket painted to look like a rusty pipe. He swung the massive barrel skyward, his eyes finding the circling Messerschmitt. Kraus, watching the sudden, grotesque transformation, felt a shock that was almost aesthetic. The dead train had sprouted spines of defiance. It was no longer a ghost. It was a porcupine of fire. He banked hard, climbing, knowing his twin-engine fighter was vulnerable to concentrated ground fire. His job was done. The bombers would finish it. But the bombers were minutes out. And in those minutes, the exposed men on Ghost 1 fought for the sliver of life they had been granted. Sokolov's DSK roared to life, a staccato thunder that shattered the valley's silence. Tracers, lurid and green, arced up towards the darkening sky, stitching a pattern of rage around the fleeing Messerschmitt. Other machine guns joined in, a sudden, desperate umbrella of fire rising from the seemingly dead train. Kraus felt rounds whip past his canopy. He jinked violently, the G-force pressing him into his seat. He had uncovered the trick, but he had also awakened the beast. He radioed the bombers, urgency now edging his calm. Heavy anti-aircraft resistance from the train. Multiple machine gun positions. Approach with caution. On the bridge, it was chaos and cacophony. The rattle of their own guns was deafening. Men shouted, pointed, fired at shadows in the gloom. Yevgeny, the artist, crouched behind a splintered timber. Not with a weapon, but with a knife, frantically slashing at the restraining cables on one of the false hulls, trying to free a tank for a desperate last-ditch defense. Grekov, in the cab, knew the machine guns were a gesture. They could harass a fighter, but they could not stop a squadron of Junkers 80s. The trestle bridge was a death trap. Their only chance was to get off it, to reach the far side and the minimal cover of a cutting. Mikhail, get this thing moving. Full power. "We have to clear the bridge." Mikhail threw the throttles wide open. The locomotive, after its long silence, gave a convulsive shudder and then a bellow of steam and effort. The couplings jerked taut with a sound like cannon shots. The ghost train, now a screaming, shooting, revealed anomaly, began to accelerate, its wounded disguise flapping and tearing in the wind of its own passage. They were a naked, roaring target in the middle of a white plain, dragging a comet's tail of gunfire behind them. And on the western horizon, black against the last ember of sunset, small, dark shapes had appeared, growing rapidly larger. The hammer was about to fall. The final brutal transition from ghost to memory was seconds away. The world dissolved into a symphony of screaming metal. The first sticks of bombs from the Junkers 80s did not hit the train. They were meant to cage it. Massive geysers of frozen earth, rock, and shattered timber erupted 50 meters ahead and behind Ghost 1 on the trestle bridge. The concussions hit like physical walls, slamming men to the decks, shattering the remaining windows in the locomotive cab. The bridge itself groaned, a deep, tortured sound felt in the bones, more than heard, over the hellish din. They were trapped on a narrow ribbon of steel, bracketed by destruction. Mikhail, blood trickling from a cut on his temple where flying glass had found him, did not slow down. He poured every ounce of steam, every gram of coal heat into the straining heart of the locomotive. The train surged forward, into the curtain of smoke and debris ahead. They hit the crater zone. One moment they were on solid track, the next, the world dropped away, beneath the lead wheels. The locomotive lurched violently, its front truck slamming down into a jagged hole torn in the bridge deck. For a second it hung there, teetering, tons of steel balanced on the brink of a plunge into the frozen river below. Then, with a shriek of tortured axles and the Herculean pull of the driving wheels, it dragged itself up and out, the tender and flat cars bucking and jarring behind it like the tail of a wounded dragon. On the flat cars, it was a maelstrom of fire and survival. The anti-aircraft guns were still firing, their tracers now weaving a desperate, futile web against the dark shapes, making their second, more accurate bombing runs. A bomb landed close alongside the third flat car. The force of the blast lifted the entire car off the rails for a heartbeat. It crashed back down, tilted at a sickening angle. 2 of the machine gun crews were simply gone, vanished into the smoke. A section of false wreckage tore free, whipping away into the night to reveal the grim, green flank of a T-34, still chained down, impotent. Captain Sokolov, thrown to his knees by the blast, rose firing, his DSK hammering at the silhouette of a Junkers pulling out of its dive. He saw sparks dance along its wing. It was a mosquito bite to a wolf. Another bomber lined up, its run straight and true, aimed at the heart of the train. In that moment, Yevgeny, the artist, found his final act of creation. He was not a soldier. He was a man of illusions, and he saw the last terrible flaw in the scene. The accelerating locomotive, belching pure white steam, a blatant, screaming sign of life against the soot-stained death of the rest of the train. He scrambled along the heaving deck of the tender, ignored by the men fighting for their lives. He reached the coal pile. He found the prepared cans, not of water, but of the thick, viscous slurry of engine oil and finely powdered coal dust, kept for just such a mechanical emergency. He didn't use it on the machinery. With a strength born of pure mania, He hauled a can up and hurled its contents directly into the locomotive's erupting exhaust stack. There was a deafening wet thump from the stack. And then, a transformation. The clean, white living steam was instantly choked. From the stack billowed a vast, rolling, black, oily smoke. It was the smoke of a catastrophic engine failure, the final death rattle of a machine giving up. It poured over the train, acrid and blinding, enveloping them in a manufactured shroud of destruction. To the German pilot beginning his final dive, the picture changed. 1 second, there was a live, speeding target. The next, a direct hit seemed to have found its boiler. A huge, black, dying smoke plume consumed the train. He saw the tilted flat car, the silent guns, the chaotic debris. He pulled up slightly, releasing his bombs a fraction of a second late. They struck the bridge just behind the last flat car, shearing the tracks and sending the rear of the train into a slow, grinding, catastrophic collapse into the ravine below. But the front half, shrouded in Yevgeny's final, magnificent lie, was now cloaked in the very evidence of its own demise. The remaining Junkers pilots, seeing the massive hit and the dense smoke, assumed the job was done. They circled once, noted the destroyed train, now motionless and bleeding black smoke, and turned for home, their bombs expended. On the bridge, the silence that followed the bomber's departure was more terrifying than the noise. It was filled with the moans of the wounded, the crackle of flames from the tender, and the groan of the mortally wounded bridge. Ghost One was dead. It had truly become the wreck it pretended to be. The forward section, including the locomotive and 3 flat cars, was crippled but on the tracks. The rear was gone. Mikhail, half blind from smoke and blood, had the presence of mind to jam the brakes, preventing what was left from rolling back into the gaping void. Grekov stumbled from the cab. The scene was one from a madman's vision. Men moved like ghosts in the smoky dark, tending to the wounded, pulling survivors from the shattered compartments. Yevgeny lay by the tender, a piece of shrapnel in his chest, his work done. Sokolov was organizing a perimeter, his face a mask of soot and grim triumph. They had been bombed, they had been destroyed, and they were alive. The final bitter irony was their salvation. The German aerial photos tomorrow would show exactly what they expected to see: a destroyed train on a broken bridge, a closed file. But the mission was not over. They were still 20 kilometers from the rendezvous point. And they had no train. As the first hint of dawn tinged the smoke pink, Grekov surveyed what remained. 1 tank on the first flat car, its disguises torn away, was salvageable. The others were gone or trapped in wreckage. But from the tombs of the 3 intact flat cars, more men emerged, shaken, frostbitten, but alive. They were not a brigade. They were a remnant. Captain Sokolov approached, his uniform torn. "What are your orders, Major?" Grekov looked east, where the other 3 ghost trains were, he hoped, still creeping through the night, their deceptions intact. He looked west, to the front, where the guns rumbled like distant thunder. The geometry of madness had fractured, but a single point had reached its coordinate. "Unchain that tank," Grekov said, his voice raw. "Get it off the flat car. Load the wounded inside and on the hull. Everyone else on foot. We move west. We tell the partisans to send the message, 'Ghost One is destroyed,' but its soul arrived." As the sun finally cleared the horizon, it illuminated a stark tableau. A shattered bridge, a truly destroyed train, and moving away from it, across the frozen river, and into the thin cover of a winter forest, A strange procession. A single battle-grimy T-34, its green paint scored and smeared with soot, ground forward. Walking beside it, ahead of it, behind it, were men. Logisticians, artists, engineers, and tankers. They were no longer cargo. They were no longer ghosts. They were soldiers. Finally on the ground, finally heading toward the sound of the guns. They had not delivered the promised steel fist. They had delivered something else. Proof that the will to arrive could forge its own impossible path. The train was dead. The idea, however, was now alive and walking, one painful step at a time, into the heart of the war.